about over lunch, I'm not sure it's really the best lunch subject, but really one of the most vexing foreign policy issues, I think, facing this country. And we've already heard about war fatigue, the fact that so many Americans really don't know much about Afghanistan or Pakistan, and in many respects get the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan confused with each other, because it's been a full decade. This panel's question is there an end game in Afghanistan and Pakistan? That causes me to wonder, end game for what? Because I don't think there's an end game for our engagement. So I'm presuming the question will be, well, end game to what part of our engagement, particularly military, and what does that look like, and what does our engagement look beyond that? So we have a very distinguished panel. Our moderator, the full bios are in your booklet, so I'm not going to read through all of those. Our moderator is Fred Hiatt, who's the editorial page editor of the Post. He spent time in Tokyo and in Moscow. He has wonderful credentials to be the moderator of this panel. He has shown flexibility, insight, and resilience, not just as an editorial writer, but because he was co-bureau chief with his wife in Tokyo and Moscow. That's probably a challenge. He's a novelist, and he writes children's books as well. So I think all of that makes him well qualified to be our moderator. As well, of course I should add, a very experienced and seasoned journalist and editorial writer in his own right. Three quite experienced and seasoned experts on our panel today. Wendy Chamberlin is the president of the Middle East Institute, where she's been since 2007, but she was ambassador to Pakistan at a otherwise uneventful time, 2001-2002. Other posts have included U.S. Ambassador to Laos, Assistant Administrator of USAID in charge of Iraqi civilian reconstruction. She's been posted in Malaysia. She's dealt with the Arab-Israeli dispute, which you didn't solve. Morocco, Pakistan, Zaire, and Laos. And she's also been Deputy United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's a pretty garden spot life, I think, in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Neumann is a career Foreign Service officer with long experience in the Middle East. He just said you can summarize me by 4 wars and 3 embassies. He was ambassador to Pakistan in 2005 and 2007. He's been ambassador to Algeria and Bahrain, so we might have a little diversion to the Arab Spring here. And before that, in Baghdad, working with the Coalition for Visual Authority and liaison with Multinational Command. So again, some very challenging positions. And last, but I have to say as a former Air Force guy, certainly not least, and I say that for the benefit of our midshipmen, retired General Michael Hayden in the United States Air Force. His military career was in intelligence and a variety of policy positions. He was commander of the National Security Agency, director of the National Security Agency, and then following the retirement, the first principal deputy director of national intelligence, the first one in that position, and then director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So we have a very distinguished panel indeed. Without any further remarks from me, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel, and I'll turn it over to Fred.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's true, I did share 2 bureaus with my wife, and you all who are avid readers of foreign news know that that's now a fairly common arrangement. In fact, we have in the audience another, Phil Townsend, who's the lesser half of another great New York Times couple. But when we went, I think we were the first ones, and it took about a year of our trying to persuade our bosses that this would be a good idea, and they kept saying, well, what if you get divorced when you're over there? Who's the bureau chief going to be? Which is a dangerous question, of course. In the end, of course, it turned out to be a great deal for them. One apartment, one home leave, and it became, a smart way to use men and women out in the field. Anyway, thank you all for coming. We have a great panel. We have possibly the most vexing foreign policy questions facing the country. So I'd like to start with Wendy. it seems as if forever people have described the U.S.-Pakistan relationship as dysfunctional. But since the raid that killed bin Laden, it seems more dysfunctional than ever. Americans were outraged that bin Laden was living so happily near a military base. Pakistanis were outraged that we violated their sovereignty. Then we were outraged that they were more outraged at that than the fact that bin Laden was living there. And now we have experts saying our policy isn't working. We have to go to a policy of containment, something different. How do you see it?
Well, I think thank you, Fred. I think it is certainly true that it looks like U.S.-Pakistani relations suddenly fell off a cliff in the days of our raid on Osama bin Laden. But I think I'd like to argue that it's, rather than a sudden event, it's been a long, slow unraveling, a long, slow building up of distrust over many years, rather than rather than a sudden crisis. And I'd like to just point out, consider this. The Pakistani public approval of the United States is one of the lowest in the world, 11–12%. But if you come home and you look at the American public's approval rating of our own Congress, it's even lower at 9%. And I tell you what, Congressmen go home every weekend to see their constituents. So, problem, yes, crisis, perhaps no. There are a number of very serious sore points. I'm keeping my eye on the rising popularity of Imran Khan as a potential president of Pakistan. Cricketer, he's very good looking, he's a charitable man, but he's also building a campaign on neo-nationalism and anti-Americanism. This is something that he's riding the wave of anti-Americanism in Pakistan. But it's Afghanistan that we're here to talk about today. And Afghanistan is certainly the issue that was quite raw in Pakistan. Let me just set it into context to help the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. The U.S. and Pakistan are caught in I call it a cycle of contradiction. We believe that we can't achieve our objective of establishing stability in Afghanistan as long as Pakistan offers safe haven to the Taliban, Omar, the Haqqanis who cross the border and attack Afghan security, NATO, U.S. troops, development projects, the U.S. Embassy, that we will not achieve stability in that country. The Pakistanis believe that we're going to leave. We've said we were. And that the United States is a very weak reed to depend on as they see increasing Indian influence and threat on their western border that squeezes them from their Indian armaments on their eastern border. And so they need a plan B. And that plan B are these Taliban proxy fighters that are in Pakistan. So we're in this circle. Now what seems to be happening just recently is it's coming to a head. We've been talking to each other for a decade, trying to build trust, trying to control Pakistani military and ISI and civilian leaders into seeing it our way. It's coming to a head. And what is the precipitating event is we're revving up to prepare for our exit, as President Obama said, in 2014 or maybe sooner. And that has caused us to, both of us, to have to lay our cards on the table. I don't think it was Osama bin Laden. I think it's more what's happening in Afghanistan, that we're finally getting to more public talk and more honest talk, dialogue about what the future will be, both in our relationship, but their relationship in Afghanistan, etc. So with that, I'll look forward to the conversation that's coming.
I want to come to the solution in a couple minutes. Mike, you've dealt with ISI, long, slow unraveling. Is that how you would describe it?
Well, I mean, there are lots of ways of looking at it. Number one, let me just say quite clearly, for CIA, we have captured more senior al-Qaeda leadership cooperating with ISI than we have with any other intelligence service in the world. So we need to take note of that. All right. Having noted that, I was struck by the ambassador's comment about, I got phone calls after the UBL raid and the worsening relationship between ISI, CIA, Islamabad, and Washington, and simply was asked, well, that's really made things worse. And what I said was, oh no, not at all. It's just torn the curtain open so that the general public can see what the real nature, how difficult this relationship has been for a very long time. Let me give you a more narrow perspective from the intelligence as opposed to the ambassadorial field of view. CIA has a liaison relationship with scores of countries around the world. And you try to work in a common space. And you're never coincident with your partner. There are always differences. But we visited Pakistan, Steve Kappas, my deputy, and I, on a routine basis. Okay? The longer I went, the more I began to think deeper thoughts beyond what was in my binder and the trip prep in the back of the C-17 for the long trip. And I began to ask myself, so what constitutes Pakistan? I mean, what makes Pakistanis believe they are Pakistanis? I mean, for you and me, frankly, it's adherence to some political principles. It's not blood or hidden. It's political document. And by the way, you get to be a citizen here by agreeing to the political document. For other nations, perhaps Germany, it's blood. So now, what's the glue that holds Pakistan together? And talking very starkly, I think of two things. Number one, it's not India. And number two is Islam. Now, whatever was in my briefing notes, whatever particular issue I had to talk to Ashraf Kayani, who was my counterpart at the time, or Ahmed Shuja Pasha, who became my counterpart, whatever was in the foreground, about, we'd like you to do this, or we're prepared to do that, what do you have to offer, what do we have to offer? The big thing in the background, when you boil the conversation down to its ultimate essence, talking to the chief of the intelligence service responsible for the safety of Pakistan, a country identified by the fact that it wasn't India and the Islamic religion. No matter what the specific issue was, what I was telling this officer was two things. Quit obsessing about the Indians, and now let's hear you talk about making the war on a particular period of Islamic extremism. You don't have to have any bad people in the room. You don't have to have no intention in the room to make that an almost impossible conversation. I think that's, right now, the essence of the stress points between ourselves and the Pakistanis. Our interests are frequently not convergent.
That's encouraging. Wendy talked about the deadline that the Obama administration has set for first ending the surge, and then next summer, and then turning things over to an Afghan lead by 2014, which is also NATO deadline. What do you think about the impact of that on our relations with Pakistan and shift to Afghanistan too, if you would?
The impact is really on the whole policy. There's kind of a precursor question that Americans really have to deal with, and that is whether the war is worth it, and whether one can succeed. It's not your question. I'm not going to spend my except to say that I believe that if we fail, we're going to have a very, very long period of profound instability in Central Asia, and we will have huge worsening of problems with Pakistan, which remains a nuclear power, and that we will invigorate jihadist movements to strike us. When they decide we can't do anything about it, we should not ignore the debate about whether those concerns are real. Just saying I'm tired and I want to quit doesn't really answer the question of what the price you will pay for being tired and quit. Within that context, you have, with the Obama administration, in my mind,
two very good decisions and one very bad decision which manages to push against itself. So that having recognized, or at least they say they recognized, the serious consequences of Afghanistan, things like that, the good war, as President Obama called it, they then made decisions to put in substantially increased forces and people money on the economic side. That was the first time we had begun to apply the resources to Afghanistan that were seriously needed since at least 2005. It would have been nice if we'd done it before, but in 2005, when we knew the war was getting worse and we did not respond, we needed to do more. But the time deadlines have cut directly across this. The first decision, we say we were going to start putting out in 2011, although it had all kinds of caveats. If you listen to the White House telephone conference call with friends, supporters, and those that you might influence, or watch congressional testimony, but the message to the world when we're starting out in 2009, that message was taken by Afghans, by Pakistanis, by insurgents, as the United States is out of here. It was also causing, frankly, strategic chaos. I was in Afghanistan in 2010. Lots of people in the ISAF daily headquarters working extraordinarily hard to make progress. No common definition of what that meant for the progress. No common view of what would happen if you get it, and no common view of what would happen if you did not get it. And that's a pretty fair definition of strategic chaos. We finally figured that out, and we have now pushed the deadline, in a sense, back to 2014. What we said actually is handoff of the security lead to Afghans in 2014. That is not withdrawal. It is not the equivalent of 2011 in Iraq. It is a presence and a policy which will require the continuation of American advisors on the ground, substantial American training, American air power, American helicopters. But the public discussion led by the President talks about the date. The Washington Post today talks about all combat troops out by 2014, which as far as I know, the administration has actually never said. So the strategic impact of this on Afghanis is to view the strategic situation after 2014 as one without the United States. For Pakistan, that means I either have to deal with India, Indian influence, all these things, or I have to support the people that are protect my border. For Afghans, it means I don't believe the United States can totally finish in 2 more years. So either I have to tighten my ties with people that fight with me, whether they're corrupt or violators of human rights or whatever, because that's the price of survival, or I have to steal more because I have to run. So you want to go in and talk to people about, we need you to clean up the government, but by the way, if you fire the people you can depend on, you can only survive if we stay for a little longer, but we can't tell you if we're going to stay. Then we wonder why this is not a persuasive dialogue. So anyway, in it, we're creating a political isometric in which our policies of resources and importance push against our policy of timeline. And you know, an isometric exercise is one in which you push against yourself, you get very, very tired, and you don't go anywhere.
Let me just play devil's advocate for ask Andy to respond, because as an editorial page, we said many of the same things. We were critical after President Obama's West Point speech that he set a deadline at the same time as he was announcing the surge. We've been critical of doing it in general based on timelines rather than goals achieved. And more recently, we've been expressed concern about the complete pullout from Iraq. So having written these things and heard from the White House, I think I can kind of say what they might answer you, which is something that all of you are familiar with. This is a democracy. We have to bring public opinion along. Getting to 2014 with NATO was an immense achievement because most of those countries were ready to pull out much sooner. And it's not realistic to think that in a democracy, you are going to be able to persuade the people, especially at a difficult economic time, after 10 years of war, to go on indefinitely. And so, you know, you're talking about one audience, they're talking about another, and there has to be some expectation for the American people and the people in our ally countries that they're standing.
I think you're stating the argument exactly correct. But I think the argument has in it a stability. First of all, you're asking Americans to die in the war, and we're killing people. Now, if you're at the same time adopting policies that make it less successful or less possible to succeed, there's a certain element of cynicism there which bothers me, even though I'm a practicing diplomat. Secondly, there is a requirement for leadership. It's true that the president has to some extent, understand where his people are and can't ignore them, especially not if he wants a second term. But the policy adopted and the policy for which NATO is planning is not the same as the policy which is being sort of sculpted in the verbiage of the press and the public. And certainly Americans will not go on with this war forever. They won't go on for a lot of years. But if you're going to say to people, we have a timeline and we're coming down in stages and we can make this work by coming down in stages and here's the resources, that's leadership. If you're saying that's kind of our policy, we don't want to tell people we want them to think something else, while we sketch out a timeline that makes it almost certain the policy will fail, then I don't find that defensible.
Not to dwell too much on the timeline, because I think that the practical consequence of the timeline is that all the parties develop their plan B. Certainly, we both mentioned, or all three mentioned the Pakistani plan B, which is to support the Taliban. But the counter measure to that is exactly what I think happened yesterday in Istanbul, where 12 of the neighbors of Afghanistan and those interested in what happens in Afghanistan met to try to hammer out some ideas on how to handle the future for it. So this regional approach, this push for a regional approach, I think is somewhat new, and it's to counteract the negative consequences of the timeline.
And I guess the other thing that they put forward as the way out is that we're going to talk with, eventually we're going to talk with the Taliban and the economy, and we're going to fight, but we're also going to bring them to the table and there's going to be some political deals. Maybe let me ask you in general, based on intelligence, is that a realistic goal?
It's less realistic if your policy is we're going to fight until a day certain, and then we're not going to fight anymore. And I think the ambassadors pointed out that's kind of what everyone is reading. It may be slightly different than what some people were writing or saying here in Washington, but that's what's being read in South Asia. And if that's the reality, I don't understand why if I'm advising the Taliban, if I'm part of their Shura Council, why do I want to rush into anything right now? Because tomorrow is going to look a lot better than today.
If they thought we were going to do a point of state, would the Taliban be reconcilable?
Just possibly. Look, there are a lot of wars that come to a close after a long time. El Salvador, India, and go a lot of places. There's a couple of common threads. You get a solution when both parties or all the parties decide they can't get their maximum in fighting. I don't think we've reached that yet. The second is that these kinds of negotiations take a long time. They usually take years of talking, loud talking before people get serious, before they finally come to closure. So it makes perfectly good sense to pursue negotiations, understanding exactly what Prime Minister Rabin said once about negotiating limits of terrorism. He said, I have to negotiate as though there was no terrorism, and I have to fight terrorism as though there was no negotiations. You have to understand that you do them both in parallel. One is the quick fix of the no.
In fact, let me just add, it doesn't have to be at the level of 130,000. Look, the size of the American footprint, the Western footprint, the competent military footprint, that matters. But in terms of the U.S. influence, the United States being able to achieve its objectives, the longevity of the American Union is probably more important. And so when we project that we're going to fall off a cliff here in terms of the American presence, I think we're just inviting everyone else in the game, number one, to go consult their own interests and go to their own interpretation of enemy, and for the Taliban, keep on fighting.
Just a couple of observations on negotiations. One, negotiations always work better when it's state to state. State to non-state actor, I'm sure somebody can tell me where it's worked, but I don't have it on the tip of my tongue. And then the second point is, I don't ever recall reading any statement by any Taliban group leader, whatever, that they have agreed to negotiation. So I'm a little more skeptical about reconciliation. Absolutely.
Well, if you assume that the Taliban had a lot of reasons to think it was, well, you've got several spoilers. The Taliban has no particular reason to do it, first of all, because they don't want to negotiate. They don't negotiate. It could be Al-Qaeda. If there's anything to be clear about the price for negotiation with us, it's that it has to be breaking the ties with Al-Qaeda. So they certainly have a motive. You can find several parties with a motive. Some of them inside Afghanistan, others outside Afghanistan who are going to tell you they can't be left out of the game. I'm not saying that the Taliban didn't do it. I'm just saying we should not rush to conclusions ahead of our facts and then draw decisions from conclusions that are based on nothing on paper.
We want to let people ask questions, but I want to come back just before we do the package. And this idea that, the essence of their identity is Islam and not being maybe cricket would be number 3. As long as I can remember, senior officials on their way to Pakistan have come to talk at our editorial board and said, but it's so obviously in Pakistan's interest to get along better with India and to understand that these irreconcilable terrorists are not going to be good for the development of Pakistan. So if we keep talking to them and presenting it to them, they will see that it's not in their interest to shelter these very, LIC and these other terrorists. Is that, what don't I get?
Well, I think part of the problem is that sometimes you conflate the Pakistan military with Pakistan. I think there are 3 Pakistans, 3 important groups in Pakistan. The military, the ISI, which I think are one. And the general well understands this. The Pakistani elites, I used to call them feudal elites, but a lot of them also, the elites that run the civilian democracy. And then the people. And in this construct, I would say that what makes a Pakistani for the people are very complicated and very strong kinship ties, their communities, and conservative Islam. I certainly agree with that. Anti-India belongs to the military. It does not belong to the civilian elites. Whenever you had a civilian elites in government, now you see more progress towards negotiation with India. As we saw last week, they want to have an event, they want to have greater trade. A lot of them have families still on the other side of the border where their kids come here for university, they marry each other. Every college campus I've been to, that young couples of Pakistani and Indians who get married. I am convinced that's not the real problem. I do think that the anti-India belongs to the military. It's a good reason to exist. It's a good reason for their credibility in the country. And it's a good reason for the military to be able to make a claim on such a large percentage of the resources of the country. I think people said 40% of the budget, maybe it's more, goes to the military. Less than one goes to education. So this anti-India thing, I'd like to say is exaggerated.
Can we get this in their interest in order to cover?
I mean, it's obvious kind of the touchstone for moving this forward over the long term. One way to convince them is the continued American interest and interest evidenced by the resources we're willing to commit. Because I've had this conversation with General Ronald, in essence talking along these lines, and I leaned forward into it and said, General, for purposes of our discussion, why don't you just assume we're going to be here forever? And obviously, he knew that wasn't true, and I knew that wasn't true. But to the degree they think we are wrong, Afghanistan is viewed almost exclusively, certainly by outside the military, through the lens of India. Its strategic depth, its strategic career, I cannot possibly take a chance with that. And so to the degree they believe we're not there, emanating from a false premise, but quite logical from that premise, quite logically, they begin to take chips off of red, us, and put them on black, which are other people they can more directly control to ensure that Afghanistan is a safe strategic area for them. That's the Pashtun tribes that straddle the Duran line, and our word for the ones they go to is Taliban. And so to the degree we look like we're not going to show up, we actually fight against that objective we just described.
Can I just do two problems? One is, it's a strange phenomenon of the American foreign policy debate that we often try to analyze and speak and talk about policy as though our policy itself is not the to drive what others do. And so we talk about whether we can persuade the Pakistanis to change, whether we can persuade the Afghans to clean up the government, when a huge piece of their strategic calculation is based on what we're going to do. So we want to treat these things as though they're intellectually completely separate. And the second is to understand that in dealing with the worldview of Pakistan, what they're going to have to deal with in Afghanistan, we don't have to win. We have to create a situation in which they believe they cannot win, the extremists cannot win. For that, it is always sufficient that you have an Afghan army that's not going to lose, that you have enough American funding over a lengthy time that that army will stay in place, that you have base and air support and training. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't mean you have to win. It doesn't mean you have a massive presence. It means that people have to believe there is a consistency in your policy that forces them to reanalyze their strategic interests.
Let's see if we have questions from the floor.
Yeah, I also don't have any questions.
I'm not sure how this is supposed to work. I guess people are supposed to go to the microphones. Is that? And here we go.
Yes. In the 19th century, it was the Mahdi that pursued the British, or the British pursued the Mahdi. We are pursuing Al-Qaeda. If we don't have these phantom organizations or real organizations, as you may see it, what is the dynamic for us continuing the effort in Afghanistan, a country that was arbitrarily created by the British, dividing ethnic groups right down the middle, causing the unrest today?
Gosh, there's an awful lot of history that I don't quite recognize there. And I'm sorry, that sounds more snide than I mean, but the Mahdi was found in the Sudan and the British won that. New York was took a few years to get there. Afghanistan is not particularly artificial. It has come into existence as a separate state in about 1746 and has managed to remain a separate state most of the time since. It has been resistant to foreigners when the foreigners tried to do complicated things, but the notion, which is one of these bumper sticker wisdoms that everybody has, that it's a xenophobic country resistant to occupiers, actually is a distortion. Even the British found they done quite well after their first invasion for about 3 years until they got really dumb and started trying to cut the subsidies and raise taxes and the budget exercise, after which they did produce a revolt. None of that is really the question. I think there are two questions. First of all, there is an Afghan national consciousness. 25 years of civil war. You had of war with the Soviets, which you did not have a single secession movement in Afghanistan. In fact, you actually had the Soviets try to create either a Tajiks or other states, or both, when they were pulling out. They wanted protection from the border, and both the Tajiks and the Uzbek leaders refused to create that state. So there is a huge lack of state governance. But you shouldn't confuse that with there not being a national consciousness. And there's a New Asia Society opinion poll, which isn't out yet, but I have to read an advanced copy. You've still got almost half the Afghans thinking the country's going in the right direction. You've got lots of natives in it, you've got lots of positives in it. But it's a much more variegated reflection of Afghan opinion than what you see here, where you have the view that it's one undifferentiated slide down the tubes.
Well, let me just maybe act as a follow-up, because I heard, in addition to the history, I think I heard, if we've beaten Al-Qaeda, why are we still running around here? And maybe let me ask you, have we beaten Al-Qaeda, and could we continue to go after them without having 100,000 troops in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, 2011 has been a real bad year for Al-Qaeda. All right. Yeah, that Sheikh Osama thing in Baghdad, Maki's death, and then the Arab awakening in the heartland of Al-Qaeda, with Al-Qaeda being irrelevant. Doesn't mean they can't exploit it, but they didn't cause it. But I would not claim that we have defeated Al-Qaeda. I think it is able to regenerate. I think we need to continue to do the things that we have been doing against Al-Qaeda. To answer your hypothetical, can we do with fewer than 100,000 troops in Afghanistan? Yes. But I don't think we can do it without a presence in Afghanistan, a substantial presence in Afghanistan. You cannot have, I mean, look, I know a little bit about this. You can't have counterterrorism forces out there isolated at the tip of the spear without some sort of support structure from which they launch what it is they're doing, even if launch is kind of a metaphorical wording rather than an actual launch of an aircraft or something like that. So again, I come back to the point, it doesn't have to be current force levels, but it has to be something. And the something has to be big enough that everyone in the neighborhood understands that you're serious. Let me give you a sense. I was President Obama's CIA chief for 3 weeks. And during that period, we had an operational success against terrorism in South Asia. And his chief of staff came up to me and said, "Hey, good on you guys. Great success." And I should have just pocketed it. If Roman Manuel saying something nice about CIA, I should have just taken it and walked away. But what I said was, "Thanks very much. But Ron, that was a CT success. Unless you're willing to do that forever, you've got to change some facts on the ground." And I think that's the distinction. Not whether we can continue to do an occasional this and that to take terrorists off the battlefield. But unless you're willing to do it forever, you've got to change something more on the front end. And I think that's what we're talking about.
My question is that despite the improvement in the past decade, many Americans still hold a negative views of Islam. How do you feel that this attitude affects U.S. foreign policies in Afghanistan and Pakistan? And would you think that trying to win the hearts and the minds of people would be less expensive foreign policy? It costs less?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. That there is enormous misunderstanding about Islam as a religion, and as a religion that has an enormous impact on the cultures of people. I'm president of the Middle East Institute. That's what we're dedicated to do, is to try to educate and promote knowledge about both Islam and the entire Middle East within the American public. And I think the misunderstandings that people around the world hear in our popular media and television programs, etc., is harmful and is hurtful. So I think all of us, the World Affairs Council, is a wonderful organization that is also dedicated to promoting knowledge. And would certainly encourage each one of you in your chapters to take this on as a mission. There is a big difference between Islamic, and Islamist, and extreme Islamists. So these distinctions have to be made in our public dialogue.
If I could just add, everything that the ambassador says is absolutely true and absolutely essential. But let me add an additional thought, maybe from a North American perspective. I mean, for an American GI, what we've been talking about here, counterterrorism or size of the footprint on the ground, that's kind of what we call the close battle. That's dealing with people who are already convinced they want to kill us. And so we need to defend ourselves against them as they kind of figuratively are coming in over the perimeter wire. We also think of the deep battle. And the deep battle has to do with the production rate of those people who next week, month, or next year are going to be coming in over the perimeter wire committed to doing us harm. In the Cold War, we had the same problem. Hold at the Fulda Gap, hold it in other places, make the military instrument unuseful to our adversary, and then fight the deep battle, which is fundamentally an ideological battle. And whatever else we may have thought about communism, it's a Western philosophy. It's written by a German in a library in London. And so we know something about it. And we have legitimacy in that discussion, saying, you know, this is even a very good theory of history. We don't have that legitimacy in what is going on within Islam. And everything the ambassador said is correct. That Al-Qaeda claims that its roots are Islamic and that they are fulfilling an Islamic vision. We don't have legitimacy in that ideological space because of who we are. And that has to take place within the Islamic community. I think both sides have challenges with which they must deal.
Thank you. Interesting. Ma'am?
Judy Rubenstein from the Naples Council, World Affairs, and also the Pittsburgh Council. My question has to do with why have we sold so much military equipment all these years to Pakistan? It seems like in 1982, when General Haq was there, we sold a lot because because India was aligned with Russia. That dynamic has changed so much since then. It's now been 30 years, and we don't want them to be militant, but we're selling them so much equipment. And wasn't that always kind of a tinderbox to maybe explode or move that we should be concerned with when maybe we went to Afghanistan or Iraq?
Arms sales. Could I get that?
Arms sales. Well, I'll let Ron help me out on this too.
Just practice
We have military supply, military sales programs with many countries throughout the world. And the theory behind it is that we build commonality. Our IVET programs build understandings between how our armies work. We want to sell our equipment abroad to our allies so that it's a way of force multiplication. And it gives our allies confidence in their own security when they have weapon systems for their own defense. Our weapons programs are for defensive purposes. We don't really prescribe to selling weapons abroad for offensive purposes, and we've been trying to be careful not to go there. Now in Pakistan, of course during the 80s, there was a lot of equipment sold. They were enormously important allies as we were trying to evict the Soviets from Afghanistan. When the Soviets left, in 1989, beginning of the 90s, and Pakistan violated some of the non-proliferation pacts and continued to build their nuclear program over our opposition, that triggered some legislation on the Hill, the Pressler Amendments, and we totally cut off all sales to Pakistan for a decade. In fact, they had even used some of their own funds to buy some F-16 fighters, which we mothballed in the desert. We wouldn't give it to them, even though they had paid for it. So we had a real break in our supply. And when I arrived in Pakistan in August of 2001, a month before 9/11, we were really at a very low point in our relations, say as low as perhaps now. We did not have an AID program, a developmental assistance program, because of the Presser amendments. We're not providing them arms sales. Their military officers were not training with ours at Leavenworth and our colleges. And we lost a whole generation of understanding between our two militaries. When I was instructed to walk in to then General Musharraf on September 16 and say, are you with us or are you against us? We really didn't have the kinds of relationships that would make that kind of a démarche a lot easier than it was at Bluebird. So our military programs have a real value in defense and stability throughout the world. I'm not a hawk, but I do support some very judicious arms sales.
Let me just follow up on that too. It's often said that in the case of Pakistan, a lot of our arms sales have been what the military wants to help them defend against India. And that we could do a better job leveraging that and insist if we're going to be sending the stuff that they want, they could do more against the terrorists that we'd like them to go after. Is there any truth to that, you think? Sure.
Talking to me. They're not one in the North Waziristan. They're not one after the Haqqani network, and we shouldn't pretend we can pay them enough to make them do it in any sort of relationship. And so I would pump up the kinds of assistance, aid, and trade that supports the civilian infrastructure, that supports business, that supports the long arc of Pakistan moving to be a modern democratic state. But I would stop pretending that we could use military assistance to get them to do something they are never going to do, and I would stop paying for it.
I certainly agree with that. And in fact, I think the Pakistani military would agree with that too. Their new line, which I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around, is we don't want your military assistance. We don't want your developmental assistance. Take it. All you do is make us, as Imran Khan says, but I also hear this from the military now, you're making us a slave to your assistance.
And they just, I met also.
They put their brake on the iron. I don't believe it. And as I pointed out earlier, there are three Pakistans. There's the civilian side who very much wants our support in the banks and the IMF. And there are the people who very much benefit from our assistance as well. So I think there's posturing going on. But I know you're going to get to the question. Let me just preempt it. What are some of the solutions? I'd say on assistance, military, etc. It's just lower our expectations. Let's ratchet back a bit.
So you've been waiting very patiently.
That's all right. Joyce Davis from Rover, Council Harrisburg. I wanted to get back to the issue that was raised that we really don't have to appear to be winning. We just have to appear that they're not winning. And I would just ask you to rethink that in light of, I've conducted many interviews with Islamic militants and with the Taliban, with folks that have written. And one of the things that strikes me is that frequently they don't think according to the ways that we think they ought to think. So what they have told me is that it's a generational war, and that it will involve trickery sometimes, which means you can appear on their part to lose and to stay underground until we're out. Then they come back with the force. So I'm wondering if that the thinking that we just don't have to appear to be losing might work for state-to-state conflict, but maybe not with this new kind of conflict that we're facing with Islamic extremism.
I guess that's one that's open and coming. I think there's a lot in what you say, and perhaps I was using shorthand. What I was focused on particularly, first of all, was Pakistan. They have a strategic view of the world, which right now revolves around a very short presumption of a short-term American departure. What I'm talking about, the Afghan army not losing, I'm talking about what is the minimum requirement to work on changing the Pakistani strategic view of the world. There's also an Afghan strategic view, which is both state and people, of what kind of actions they have to take in order to assure their survival. That is also heavily conditioned by their understanding of what we're going to do. In March, when I was back, I saw President Karzai, I saw a lot of bitterest opposition opponents, and one thing they all agreed on was we have no idea what the Americans intend to do after 2014. And I don't think that has gotten better. When you get down to the insurgents, and I think the point you're raising is very important, but then I would add another, you don't have one group, you have multiples. And I don't think their interests are all the same. You may not be able to have a negotiation success at all, period, with some of the people involved in insurgents. That is certainly a possibility. But that simply goes back to the other point I made, which is that one has to be able to both fight and talk. You talk in order to explore what may be possible. And you fight in order to make it very clear that the other side doesn't get a free victory. And whether or not you can get to success, I don't know. Ultimately, that's a question Afghans are going to have to work out. You may also find that you get, I'm not going to say this is a projection, but you don't always have to have a negotiated result. After 2001 and our invasion, an awful lot of Afghans just went home. When the hardest core of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were looking around all of a sudden saying, where are my buddies? Because everybody else just basically went home. Now, some of the Afghan authorities that took over did a pretty poor job and leaned on a lot of those people in a way that prevented them from reintegrating. But there's a lot of, all I'm saying is, there are a lot of informal pieces as well that could come into place, but there's no guarantee they will.
Bill Clifford of World Boston. What will the shape of these economies be and the American role in the end game? And is this notion of a new Silk Road a fantasy, meaningful vision, or an achievable reality?
Well, we can talk about that for a minute, I guess, but I don't want to press my comment. The Silk Road concept is serious, but it is not short-term. And I think we talk about it a little too much as though it could be a short-term deliverable. There are alternative silk routes, and one of them that would work quite well happens to move across Iran, which we may not see as politically desired. Secondly, the shape of the economy is a little hard because I talk about the Afghan, or when you talk about Pakistan, there's a whole bunch of things that are coming into view in the case of Afghanistan, which may be real game changers, but we don't quite know enough to say that. Oil deposits, gas deposits, rare minerals, copper, iron, coal, gemstones. But in every case, there are issues that make it, there's exploration that has to take place, quite apart from war and security, legal structures. There are pieces that still have to be explored before you go so far as to say, we got it, this is going to do what we need to do.
Is there hope for the Pakistan economy?
Well,
In 1 minute or less?
Pakistani economy is pretty grim. At this moment, I was told yesterday they have $20 billion of foreign exchange, but they could run through it very quickly, in which case they will have to come back to the IMF, and they will have to ask us to help them within the IMF. There was a time in 2008 when they were at a very low period as well, and they did not want to go and meet some of the conditions that the IMF asked them to do, so they said, we'll go to the Chinese, which they tend to do. Well, we'll go to the Chinese, we have this alternative, we don't need you in the United States, we don't need the Western institutions. And the Chinese said, go back to the IMF. So I think there are some hard realities that very good economists in Pakistan have to face, but it's a very difficult political situation that they are in as well, with the army having a lot of power.
I wonder if I might invite you to widen the aperture a little bit and think about the Arab Spring. There's a lot of expertise, presence in across North Africa and the Middle East and Persian Gulf. What effect, if any, has the Arab Spring had on developments within Afghanistan and Pakistan in terms of their view of the world? And I'm particularly thinking about this question that you raised before: what is the United States going to do? We haven't had a particularly consistent approach in dealing with all the variations of the Arab Spring. Some would say consistency in foreign policy is overrated. But how would Afghanistan and Pakistan look at us in responding to the Arab Spring and engage where the United States is?
Well, this is an indirect answer to your question back to the ideological battle and the deep fight, and we don't have much legitimacy of the discussions about the meaning of Islam. We do have legitimacy when the discussion changes. And despite all the turbulence and lots of things to worry about in the near to midterm, and maybe some long-term things are going to be dark coming out of the Arab awakening, one of the things that it has done is to inject a debate in the heartland of Al-Qaeda about transparent and responsive governments representing the people and serving the citizens of the nation which they pretend to govern. We know something about that. We have legitimacy in that discussion. For the first time since 9/11, in my view, I actually see grounds for American participation in what I'm describing to you as the deep fight, which is the long-term ideological discussion. So in that sense, it's a plus.
Yeah.
You can argue that Pakistan had its Arab Spring with the lawyers' movement in late 2007, when hundreds of thousands of people poured out in the streets, demanded a return to civilian democracy, and that President Bashar would take off his uniform, which for the first time in Pakistani history he did, and there was a peaceful transfer of the military government to an elected civilian government. And then the lawyers' movement that people had a lot of real optimism about seemed to, I don't know, melt away. And I think this shows the strength of the 3 points that I made earlier, that actually was well drawn out in Anatole Levin's book. The importance of kinship, community, and conservative religion just sort of absorbs all more radical movements within Pakistan. So I think they've had their Arab Spring that came before Cairo.
I think Afghanistan, and I agree with both Wendy and General Hayden on the larger context, the Pakistani context. Afghanistan, I would say, first of all, very few people are paying attention. They are totally absorbed with the issues inside Afghanistan and survival and warfare. Arab Spring does not have a lot of residents. Secondly, the majority of Afghans who can get really enthusiastic about principles and go to the barricades and demonstrate and die about principles are dead. They are dead in 30 years of warfare. People want peace. They'll pay a very high price for peace. They like a better government. They like a better life. They're not going to get real motivated in the middle of the 31st or 32nd year of war by the Arab awakening.
Maybe last question.
LJ Stanbrook, the Role Affairs Council of Charlotte. China, what is China doing in Afghanistan? And then second part is Kashmir. That is the real point of contention between India and Pakistan. What could you tell us more about Kashmir, and is that going to be resolved in our lifetime?
Yeah, I do the Afghan part really quick, the China part. The Chinese are bidding on various kinds of minerals. They've already won a $3 billion investment in copper, not a bad amount of money, and they are bidding on others. They do construction projects. They've given a little bit of aid. They do not involve themselves militarily. I've asked them, Chinese representatives on some occasions, how much do you feel this Islamist movement in Afghanistan is a threat? I never got a really clear answer from them. My guess is that they think it's something bothersome, but not something where they see themselves as a real game changer. So they go after things they are interested in, but they don't do more. But I'm guessing.
Before we do Kashmir, maybe a word on China and Pakistan. What's their interest there?
I mean, obviously, as the ambassador pointed out, they think that's an out. I think they're overly optimistic about that. When we threaten to withhold something, they may bluster about turning to the Chinese, but I don't think in most cases it's a realistic option. And over time, I think they'll learn that.
I think that's true, and I think that the Chinese investment, foreign direct investment, and is exaggerated enormously by the Pakistani press. You can't get any statistics from the Chinese press. They don't release it, which tells you something. But their grant aid is infinitesimal when compared to our grant aid for humanitarian disasters like the earthquake and the flood and the internal displaced movements. The Chinese simply do not invest as much as they're getting credit for in Pakistan. On Kashmir, of course it's an issue that has to be resolved between India and Pakistan if they're moving forward. I'd like to leave with a private thought, and that is that right now, this year, this is the best time. It's never been as good as it is now for some real meaningful discussions on the Kashmir issue. Why? Prime Minister Singh will not be running for re-election. He has a few more years, and this is the time politically in India where the Prime Minister could show some leadership. Number two, within India, the issue has become less in Kashmir, for India, for Delhi, has become less Pakistan and more India for its own domestic purposes. The separatist, Indian Kashmiri separatist movements has become the focus of the problem for New Delhi. This is added emphasis for moving on a resolution of the Kashmir, perhaps in some kind of an autonomous status, whatever. But I think and I would urge and always have, is that the United States that has influence in Delhi, we've expanded our influence enormously over the last 10 years through trade, through our nuclear energy pact, through our defense relations, but we've been reluctant to ever use it with Delhi. And we should not be so shy about talking privately, perhaps, but talking to take this burr out from under the saddle, because there won't be regional stability in the region unless this one's dealt with.
Let me get instructions from my boss. It's 1:30, and one more person. Can we do it, or go ahead?
Several years ago, Senator Lugar and others, I believe, supported significant dollars to be sent over schools and for aid to people. I'm just wondering, is there any way to measure the effect, the efficacy of that, and what that holds, for that long-term fight we're talking about too?
Was that an Afghan?
Pakistan?
Sorry. Yes.
Sorry.
Did the civilian aid that Lugar
for
schools, what did that buy us?
Well, the dirty little truth is not all of it has been distributed. We pledged $1.5 billion. There's been some great confusion on how to distribute that through normal USAID practices of drawing up a country plan, and then contracts and getting it out to mostly international NGOs. Richard Holbrooke said that's not the way to do it. Let's try to use domestic Pakistani NGOs, put it through the government so we can build the capacity of the government. They had lost a number of months, year doing that. And then, and my knowledge of this is imperfect, so I hope I'm not confusing people, but my understanding was then you had the problem with the capacity wasn't there. So I think, at least at the time, last time I was in Pakistan, last February, right in the middle of the Ray Davis thing where nothing was moving, very little as a proportion of that initial 1.5 billion was put into play. And the Pakistanis, and I met with many Pakistani NGO types in the civil society, because I think that's what the answer is, the civil society, said, we don't see it. We don't see it. I said, oh, we don't see it because it hasn't been distributed yet.
Sounds like the stimulus bill.
My view is, yes, it's a good parallel. My view is absolutely consistent with the generals, and that is Project aid may not be the way to go, but enterprise zones, the ROZs, the trade aid, lifting of tariffs on important exports in Pakistan like textiles, these are the things that will create jobs for Pakistanis, not just for American aid workers.
Last question.
Thank you. This is actually the second time this has happened. I guess in the discussion about endgame, I'm interested. It seems valid to ask about what victory looks like, and I guess we've kind of defined it broadly. But I'm wondering if we could really put our nose to the grindstone and try to discuss what victory is.
I will give you a definition, I think, what it means in Afghanistan. It means a military with enough competence to keep violence down to a fairly low level in its difficult society. And it means a government with enough popular support that it can persevere as it develops over many years. And it's not the moment on the Missouri, but it is an army that can maintain a basic peace and coherence in the country, and a government that can have enough support of its own people to both stay in power and support the army without endless political crisis. That's about all it is. That is a huge task to produce.
All right, well, thank you so much for a lot of